In this course, we'll be building a simple coffee application that consists of two resources, users and coffees. As we've already mentioned in the first lesson, we'll assume that you're familiar with everything we've covered in the fundamentals course. Alright, so let's start by building our application and head over to our terminals and create a fresh Nest application by entering in the nest new command. The Nest CLI is going to prompt us, as always, asking what name we want to use for this new project. Let's call it auth-extension. Once everything finishes, let's cd or change directory into our newly created application by entering cd auth-extension. Next, let's generate two resources, coffees and users. To help speed up this repetitive process, the Nest.js CLI provides us with a generator or schematic that automatically generates all of the boilerplate code to help us avoid doing all this manually and to make the developer experience that much simpler. Let's use it by running nestg-resource and let's call it coffees. This command will prompt us asking what transport layer we want to use in our project. We'll choose REST API. As for the next question, would you like to generate CRUD entry points? Let's say yes and have some endpoints generated for us, which we will protect later on in this course. As you can see on the screen, the resource schematic generated a module to keep code organized and establish clear boundaries, grouping related components, a controller with nestg controller to define CRUD routes, a service with nestg service to implement and isolate business logic, an entity class to represent the resource data shape, and lastly, data transfer objects or inputs for GraphQL applications to define how the data will be sent over the network. Now let's generate the users resource using the same command via nestg-resource, and let's call it users. With our two resources in place, let's start up our application to make sure everything's working. Let's fire up the app in development mode with npm run start:dev. Great, everything works so far. In our terminal, we can see that both users module and coffees module were successfully initialized. We can even see some endpoints registered in our project. Great. Let's open up the users service file real quick and see what we have in there so far. As we can see, the CLI generated service classes are not tied to any specific ORM or data source. This makes the generator generic enough to meet the needs of any project. By default, all methods will contain placeholders, as we can see on the screen, allowing us to populate the service with the data sources specific to our project. In this extension, similarly to what we did in the fundamentals course, we'll be connecting our application to a Postgres database with the help of the TypeORM library. Remember, in your project, you can use any data source you wish, any ORM you prefer, be it Mongoose, Nex, MicroORM, etc. You could even use database drivers directly and run plain SQL queries, anything your applications need. We are specifically using TypeORM here in this course, but just know that you are not limited to using TypeORM in your future applications by any means. Since we don't want to spend too much time explaining all the configuration-related pieces again, if you're unfamiliar with everything or just need a refresher, please check out lesson number 3, Add PostgreSQL with TypeORM, from our fundamentals course to learn more about Docker, TypeORM module, and so on. Back to our code, let's get some of the same setup out of the way in our application here and start by creating a docker-compose.yaml file in the project's root directory. Inside this Docker Compose file, let's define a database container in YAML format. You can find the code to copy-paste here below the course video. Now, let's bring our container up using Docker Compose. In our terminal, make sure we're at the project's root directory, and let's enter in docker-compose up-d. Note, make sure to have Docker itself up and running in the background before running this. Great. We now have a Postgres database running in the background. Now for the Nest.js TypeORM portion. Let's get the necessary dependencies installed for our application, which are at nestjs/typeorm, typeorm, and pg for Postgres. Remember, TypeORM can integrate with many other databases, but we'll be using Postgres as it's powerful, efficient, and free. Once the installation process is complete, let's open up our app module.ts file and head over to the imports array. In here, let's import the typeorm module from the Nest.js typeorm package and add it into our imports array. Next, let's initialize this module by calling the forRoot method, which lets us configure the connection to typeorm, as well as a few additional tools available to integrate it with Nest.js. Let's enter in the following configuration options that we set up in our Docker Compose file, and we should be all set. Remember, you can find the code to copy-paste for this right below the course video. With Docker and typeorm portion all set up, let's open up our user entity file that was already generated by the resource schematic and add a new entity decorator on top, making sure to import it from typeorm. Next up, let's add a few columns for ID, email, and password. And now that we have the basics of our entity set up, let's register this user entity in our application. To achieve this, let's open up our users module and first create an import array inside of the module decorator. In this imports array, let's add typeorm forFeature, passing in an array with our users entity inside of it. And just like that, we created our first database entity and table within our Postgres database. Now that we have all of this in place, we can start using a real database in our application.